You're listening to Tales from the Ridge. Episode 10, The Good Ship Genesis, Part 3.
Eli's paws trembled over Zion's mouth as Captain Micah strode through the small space of the escape pod. His back was to them as another officer joined, the two of them observing the Lofoxus with intensity. "This batch should be ready by the time we make our next refueling stop. It's a good thing we had this backstock to trade at Gamma. This buyer is offering a large sum. We'll be able to spread the winnings out quite generously, as well as purchase supplies. Ensure Officer Ezra is prepared to negotiate with his connections during the court-martial." The officer sighed. "I can't believe Amos is the one that made trouble." Micah nodded his head in agreement. "That mechanic, the new one, Eli. She's been poking her nose around the same way. Can't get rid of her so quickly after Amos. That'll look suspicious," the officer pointed out. "If we could find some way to get him to indict her on the stand." "I don't think there's a chance of that," Micah cut the officer off. There was a silence in the escape pod. Eli held her breath. "Tend to your duties and then lock up." Micah strode from the escape pod. "Yes, sir," said the officer. When the hatch closed, Eli watched the officer's demeanor shift completely. He took his sweet time with whatever chores he was allocated in the care of the illicit drug, his movements casual. When he, too, finally left the escape pod, Eli and Zion practically melted across the floor in relief. "I thought they would never leave," Zion moaned. "Come on." Eli hoisted the both of them up. "We've got the journey back yet." The two Vox crept carefully from the escape pod and helped each other back into the vent system. The ship had already grown even quieter with the hour or so that had passed. It was now only the soft routine management of the night shift that made any noise at all. That and the irregular groans, hisses, and creaks the old steamer Genesis made on her own. The entire way back, Eli could hear Zion hiccuping through suppressed sobs. When the door to their bunk creaked shut behind them, the younger Vox burst into tears. "How dare they?" she spat, the fur of her cheeks thoroughly wetted down already. "I mean, Lofoxus is worth a lot." "You don't get it, Eli," Zion cut her off. "You weren't born and raised on the Genesis. You haven't seen how Micah treats folks who get hooked on that stuff." She paused to blow her snout loudly into a hanky. "I've seen folks who needed help, good folks who made a mistake, airlocked for having a dime's worth of that drug on them, saying it's a sin, an affront, and he's been growing it this whole time." "Shh," Eli warned. "Someone will hear you. You gotta calm down." Zion buried her face into Eli's shoulder as she continued to cry, the sound muffled by her uniform. By the time Zion calmed, she and Eli said not 2 words to each other before passing out in Zion's bed, curled next to each other, the mental and physical toll of the past few days finally consuming them completely. The morning alarm was so jarring, Eli nearly rolled from the bunk. She could feel the stiff awkwardness of the fur of her cheeks pointing every which way, having slept like a rock. Eli moved groggily through breakfast, barely speaking to a curious Hiram who quietly pestered her over the grits and eggs on their trays. Finally, halfway through the first fix of the day, Eli spoke. They were in steerage, fixing a cooling alarm that had been malfunctioning of late, and there was not a soul to overhear them. Micah and the officers are running LaFoxus. Hiram dropped the tool in his hand out of surprise, every inch of fur on his body flattening in fear. "What?" his voice squeaked. "They're using that escape pod to grow it in." Eli walked Hiram through what she and Zion had found. With every word, the elder Vox's eyes grew wider and wider. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to reveal his operations at Amos's hearing. There's a chance for folks to speak up in defense of the accused, correct?" "Yes," Hiram said, "though folks are usually too scared to do it." "Well, I ain't." Eli attacked a bolt with her wrench, feeling the heat of her anger bubbling up. "Micah ain't going down without a fight. Eli, this won't be easy." "I think I might have an idea about that," Eli said quietly. Hiram sighed and met her gaze. "I thought you might." That evening, just before dinner, the Genesis docked at Station Gamma. It was always a special time, the hours they were allowed off the ship to use their hoarded credits to peruse the offerings of the galaxy. This time, Eli, Zion, and Hiram ventured out together. Eli hoped combining their credits would be enough. "Where do you think would be a good place to look?" Eli sighed deeply through her nose. It had been a while since she had last set foot on Station Gamma, back before this job on the Genesis. "If I remember correctly, there's a saloon by the name of Last Stop that hosts a fair number of folk." "Folk of the variety we're looking for?" asked Hiram, his eyes darting around the crowds of sentience that pushed about them. Eli nodded, watching Zion's awe as they passed into the station's center, the ceiling suddenly vaulting upward into a circling dome, each balcony glittering with neon lights. Eli led them confidently through the throng. Their small Vox bodies buoyed like flotsam through an ocean. An all-glass elevator shot them upward toward the top floor, where somehow the lighting itself seemed to get grimier. As the three Vox stepped out into the balcony, they all pressed closer to one another out of instinct. A Jontar bouncer stood at the outside of the Last Stop saloon, her turquoise scales gleaming against the green sign of the bar. She stood to her full height as Eli, Zion, and Hiram approached, flexing her forearms tightly across a barrel chest. "No Vox." Eli's fur fluffed out in anger, ears pinning to her skull. "That ain't right," was all she managed to say in response. "Is rule. No Vox," said the Jontar with a somehow intimidating shrug. "They're with me." The voice came from behind the three Vox, making all of them jump. Eli saw the Jontar stiffen in surprise as a human hand settled down onto Eli's shoulder. "These are some clients of mine, Bede," said the human woman, her black Stetson casting dark shadows across her face. "Let 'em in with me, or I'll raise a ruckus. Your pick." Eli's eyes darted toward the Jontar, who was staring daggers through the human woman. The woman in black seemed unconcerned. "Fine." The human nodded, and the three Vox followed her timidly inside. "You three seem to be on the lookout for something, or someone," said the woman in black, "if you don't mind me saying so." Zion glanced anxiously at Eli, who cleared her throat. "We're looking to hire some muscle." The woman gestured to a booth in the far corner. The three Fox hopped awkwardly up onto the worn-out leather seats. "What kind of muscle?" "Drinks?" asked a sensuous voice as a scantily clad bartender appeared tableside. "My usual, Tara. And for my friends here..." Zion looked bashed. Alcohol was expressly forbidden aboard the Genesis. Eli was surprised when Hiram spoke up. "3 whiskey gingers, please." The server, who Eli guessed was a Therian, grinned, white teeth gleaming at them from an attractive androgynous face. "Cute," they said, and sidled off with the order. "How do we know we can trust you with information?" Zion asked in a moment of bravery. The woman in black gave a genuine smile and an endearing chuckle. "Well, I already helped you into this bar now, didn't I? What cause would I have to put my neck on the line like that unless I was a relatively trustworthy sort?" The three Fox exchanged looks again. "Who are you?" Eli asked as the drinks arrived. She took a tentative sip. Unlike Zion, she had had the pleasure of a good drink before, but it had been ages. The sweetness of the ginger ale slid over her tongue, softening the bite of the whiskey. The stranger took a long drink of her own glass and pulled a cigar from her coat pocket. "The name's Cash," she said as she clipped the tip and lit up. "Cash Guthrie. I'm a bounty hunter of sorts." "You might just be who we need then," Zion said enthusiastically. Eli noted she had already finished half her drink. "We, have a captain we need to..." Eli struggled. "Depose," said Hiram affirmatively. "Interesting," said Cash, leaning forward on her elbows. "What did this captain do to deserve a mutiny?" After a deep sigh, Eli relayed the tale of the last few days aboard the Genesis. The three Vox had finished their booze at the end of it, but Cash's remained almost untouched. The bounty hunter threw back her drink in one gulp and snuffed her cigar. "My posse and I will help you." "This is all we have," said Zion, setting their paltry earnings on the table. Cash eyed the funds for a moment and then shook her head. "Pay me when it's over." "How will we get them on the ship?" Zion asked. "Everyone will be at the court-martial. We wait until it's underway, then sneak them in," said Eli confidently. "What's your plan here?" asked Cash. "You want us to take him out?" "No," said all three Vox loudly, turning a few heads toward them. "It won't mean anything if we take him out by force. The crew has to be behind us," said Eli. "We just need protection and muscle to force Micah to listen." Cash nodded. "All right. How much resistance should we expect?" "I wouldn't expect much in the form of physical violence," Hiram said stoically. "Micah is unlikely to display any aggression like that. It doesn't fit his image." "We're backing him into a corner," Zion pointed out. "I think it's possible he might retaliate." "How many folks might be on his side?" Cash asked grimly. "Hard to say," Eli admitted. "The officers, at least, which number about 20 in all." "No personal weapons, though," said Zion. "Those are locked away for use only in the case of hostile boarding. Let's run through this plan." Cash rubbed her forehead with the butt of her hand and sighed. They spent what little time they had hashing out a few of the details with Cash, explaining the ship's layout and the procedure of the court-martial. As they sat, Eli became aware that a group of people were slowly forming around Cash's side of the booth. Another human woman with similar features, 2 human men who looked identical to one another, and a female Jontar. Cash introduced them as her crew, and Eli's eyes moved slowly over them. "You think the 5 of you can handle this?" Eli asked dubiously. Cash stood slowly with a crooked grin. "Oh, we've got your back." "How many Vox do you think you can take, Tack?" asked the other human woman of the Jontar. Tack spread out every finger on all 4 of her hands. "This many." "Wow," was Zion's breathless response. The large lizard woman grinned down at her. The blast doors to the ship were shut when Eli and the odd melange of sentience now following her arrived. Hiram entered the code to lift the doors, and Eli took a deep breath as the metal groaned upward. As they passed through the gangway, the emptiness left their collective footsteps to make hollow echoes down the corridor. As they neared the mess hall, the sound of Micah's voice, muffled but still recognizable, assaulted them. Zion's fur went flat, ears pinned back. Eli reached down and took her hand. "Hey," she said softly. "It was awful brave of you to get involved with all of this." Zion's gaze darted toward Eli. "I couldn't just let it happen." Hiram reached out and ruffled the young Vox's head. "I sure appreciate you helping save Amos, Z, regardless of why." Zion nodded, tears, whether of fear or sadness, welling up in her eyes. The doors to the mess were wide open, and the odd group stepped through. The entire crew of the Genesis was assembled, every foot of space occupied by Vox. Through the sea of multicolored fur, Eli could see Micah and the other officers upon a platform erected for the tribunal, with Amos sat in the middle of their semicircle. Micah was mid-rant about Amos's supposed crimes. Eli felt her blood begin to boil. "Cash, come with me. The others, stay here with Zion and Hiram." Cash nodded, and her crew did the same, clearly willing to follow Eli's lead. With a deep breath, Eli began to push forward through the crowd, but as folks noticed the bounty hunter trailing her, the group began to part of its own accord. Hushed conversations began to strum up around them, and soon the murmurs spread, the arrival of Eli and the strangers rolling like a wave of information across the room. Captain Micah could not ignore the interruption or the whispers, turning his stony gaze toward its zenith. "Sister Eli, what is the meaning of this interruption?" he asked, eyes locking onto Cash's stoic form with a hint of wariness. "We're here to speak in Amos's defense." "Who are these strangers that you have brought into the very heart of the Genesis?" the captain asked haughtily, his tone belying the ripple of anger that threaded his words. "They're here to make you listen," Eli shouted over the crowd. "See, Amos ain't guilty of nothing except investigating your own corruption, Captain Micah, sir." Micah's ears flattened against his skull, his emotions getting the better of him for once. He stared down at Eli from the platform, a righteous fire burning in his eyes. "How dare you?" "How dare I?" Eli replied, seeing Cash's hand hovering over the shock pistol at her hip. "How dare you, sir? How dare you grow and distribute Lafoxus right under the nose of your own crew, hijacking the systems of the Genesis itself to do it?" The gasp that went up from the crowd seemed to suck all of the air out of the room. Micah's eyes widened to the size of dinner plates, his snout opening into a snarl. Eli continued, detailing the events of the last 2 days. As she spoke, the officers' circle began to draw tighter around Captain Micah, the tension in the room pulling the guilty together like a thread. A group of leaders from each deck volunteered to investigate the escape pod, guarded by Barker and Boone, the 2 twins of Cash's crew. When they returned, they confirmed Eli's accusations. The tensions in the room turned to palpable wrath. Micah's gaze darted about the roiling sea of Vox, searching for allies where none were to be had. "Lock 'em in the brig!" a voice shouted, followed by a cheer of confirmation from the crowd. A few of the officers attempted a dash toward the door, but were quickly blocked by Tack's large and imposing form. The Jontar flashed them a wolfish grin, and the Vox demurred. At the end of shock pistols provided by Cash's crew, Micah and the other officers were ushered into the lower decks. The former captain's livid eyes held Eli's gaze as the blast doors shut behind them. "Eli!" a familiar voice called to her through the crowd. As Eli turned, Amos's wide arms wrapped her tightly in a hug and lifted her briefly from the ground. "I can't believe you did this," he said, setting her down, voice breathless. "Nothing I hate more than a hypocrite," Eli said. "Besides, it was my fault you got into that mess, so I had to get you out." "Sorry to interrupt." Cash's low tones broke over them, and Amos looked up at the human with a slow blink. "But, I think that's all you need me for?" Cash's face split into a crooked grin. "Gotta say, that was the easiest job I've ever had." "Just stand there and look tough," said June, appearing at her sister's side. "I suppose you want your money?" Eli began to pull out the funds she, Zion, and Hiram had compiled. Cash stopped her with a wave of her hand. "This took all 2 hours of our time, Sister Eli. Not a shot fired. I'd say you did the work yourselves. Besides, now we've got an interesting story," June pointed out. "Ain't every day a non-Vox gets a step on one of these steamers." Eli's voice choked up, the emotion of the moment finally finding her. "Thank you." "See you around, Eli," said Cash with the tip of her black Stetson. She and her crew began to trek back toward the gangplank doors, Tack giving one last wave with all 4 of her hands. "What happens now?" asked Zion as the crowd moved back to the upper decks. "A tribunal to choose a new captain and officers," said Amos. "Well, I know who's got my vote for captain," said Hiram with a wink at Eli. Amos and Zion both nodded, their eyes twinkling commiseratory. "Oh, for Pete's sake," Eli sighed.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Tales from the Ridge. A special shout out to all my patrons: Bonnie, Mara, Rachel, AB, Robert, Claire, Susasaurus, Matthew, Taysom, Vicky, Michael, Willow, Jill, Orsoya, Jessica, Franchon, Fritz, Rodney, Andrew, Megan, Kira, Katie, Camille, Emily, Andy, and Kat. If you like Tales from the Ridge, please consider joining my Patreon. I wouldn't be able to do it without you guys. Once you join, you'll have access to special content like the Bookies podcast, all my ongoing manuscripts, and so many other projects. And once again, thanks for listening.
Eli's paws trembled over his heart. There, I got it.
I don't hate that as much as you